Imagine finding out that a disease affecting nearly 100 million Americans was historically diagnosed because ancient doctors noticed a patient's urine attracted ants.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild historical fact.
It sounds like something out of medieval folklore, right?
Uh-huh.
But that sweet-smelling symptom is literally the origin of our entire understanding of diabetes.
It really is.
So today we are pulling from this highly detailed course article. It's titled Insulin Resistance and Diabetes, and it comes to us from My-Nutri-Diary.
Right, which is a great platform.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, it functions less like a simple calorie tracker and more like a comprehensive coach for nutrition and healthy aging.
Exactly. And the value of this specific source material is that it bypasses the standard, generic advice of just telling people to eat less sugar
Right, which we hear all the time.
all the time. But this article forces us to look under the hood, so to speak, at the cellular mechanics of our metabolism.
Mm.
We're talking about the actual biochemistry of how your body processes energy, where the signaling breaks down, and most crucially, how the choices you make every day can actively rewrite that biological script.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is to decode the mechanics of insulin resistance, right? To figure out how it dictates the aging process and to explore the very real possibility of achieving disease remission.
Which is huge.
It is. But to understand a system failure, we kind of have to establish what the system looks like when it's running flawlessly.
That makes sense.
So you consume carbohydrates, your digestive tract breaks them down, and then this massive influx of a simple sugar called glucose just hits your bloodstream.
Yeah, and your body now faces an immediate logistical challenge.
Right.
Because that glucose is pure biological currency, and it needs to be stored rapidly in specific reservoirs, primarily your liver, your muscle tissue, and fat cells.
Because it can't just hang out in the blood.
No, exactly. Left to circulate endlessly, glucose is useless, and as we'll discuss shortly, it's highly destructive.
Wow, okay.
So the pancreas acts as the central command center here. It releases the hormone insulin into the blood to manage this massive influx of energy.
I want to focus on the cellular level here, if that's all right, because the common analogy of insulin acting as a key unlocking a door, I don't know, it always felt a bit simplistic to me for what is actually a highly sophisticated mechanism.
I completely agree. It's much more complex.
Right, so think of your muscle cells like a highly secure automated data center.
Oh, I like that.
The glucose molecules are like this massive influx of external data packets trying to get in. And insulin is the cryptographic protocol that docks with the receptor on the outside of the server farm.
That is a great analogy. And following that logic, when the insulin protocol successfully authenticates at the receptor, it triggers an internal command.
Okay.
So deep inside the cell, there are these specialized transport proteins known as GLUT4. That's glucose transporter 4, and they're just stored in reserves.
Just waiting around.
Exactly. The insulin signal commands these GLUT4 proteins to physically migrate from the interior of the cell up to the outer plasma membrane.
Wait, so they physically move?
Yes, they move. They embed themselves into the cell wall, effectively opening high bandwidth physical ports, that pull the glucose out of the bloodstream and into the cell.
That is it's a stunning piece of microscopic choreography.
It really is.
But, systems have limits. So let's go back to those ancient doctors and the ants. The medical term is diabetes mellitus, right? And mellitus is a Latin word meaning honey sweet.
Yep.
So when this transport system fails, blood sugar remains chronically high. And the body senses this impending toxicity and activates a pretty crude emergency override, right? The kidneys attempt to manually filter the excess sugar out of the blood and just excrete it through urine.
Right. And what's fascinating here is understanding why the body views circulating glucose as toxic.
Because it is, right?
Yeah, your kidneys have a hard limit on what they can filter. When blood sugar remains chronically elevated past that limit, the glucose molecules undergo a process called glycation.
Glycation.
They literally bind to proteins and lipids in your blood vessels, creating what are known as advanced glycation end products, or AGs.
And the article said they act like microscopic shards of glass.
Yeah, that is a very accurate way to visualize the damage.
That's terrifying.
It is. Over years and decades, this glycated blood acts as a corrosive agent. It slowly degrades the structural integrity of your capillaries, it damages your delicate nerve endings, and, it ruins the kidney's filtration system.
So it's not an overnight thing.
No, it's a quiet, systemic degradation that paves the way for major cardiovascular events like strokes and heart attacks. This is the actual physiological toll that accelerates the aging process.
Wow. So the stakes are incredibly high for healthy aging, which brings us to the breakdown of this intricate system.
Right.
The insulin protocol docks, but the GLUT4 ports refuse to open. The cellular data center is basically rejecting the incoming shipment. And we call this insulin resistance.
Exactly. Insulin resistance is fundamentally a problem of diminished cellular sensitivity. Your liver, your muscle, and your fat tissues just, well, they stop responding to the blood sugar lowering effect of insulin.
They just ignore it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It is heavily driven by a sedentary lifestyle, poor dietary quality, and crucially, an excess of visceral fat.
Okay, visceral fat.
Because visceral fat isn't just passive storage, it's actually an active endocrine organ that secretes inflammatory cytokines.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and these inflammatory molecules actively interfere with the insulin receptor's signaling pathway.
So it's essentially a localized interference signal.
Spot on.
The cells reduce the number of receptors on their surface to protect themselves from what they perceive as an overwhelming, endless supply of energy. So the glucose piles up in the bloodstream. The pancreas senses this rising tide and interprets it as a weak signal. Its solution is basically brute force, right?
It just cranks it up.
It starts pumping out massive abnormal amounts of insulin to shout over the interference and force the cells to respond.
And this right here is the defining characteristic of prediabetes. Your pancreas is operating at maximum capacity, pulling double shifts to keep the system functional.
Just redlining.
Exactly. And for a while, this compensation actually works. Blood sugar levels might look somewhat normal on a basic test, but underneath, you have hyperinsulinemia, which is chronically high insulin, and you have overworked pancreatic beta cells.
Okay, and the data on this from the My-Nutri-Diary article is honestly staggering.
It's scary.
In 2019, roughly 1/3 of all U.S. adults, that's 96 million people, were living with prediabetes.
A third.
But here's the piece of data that demands scrutiny. Over 80% of those people had zero idea they had the condition. If the pancreas is essentially redlining its engine, like you said, and the blood vessels are beginning to experience glycation, how on earth can 80 million people be walking around without a single alarm bell going off? I mean, how do you not know?
Because evolution optimized us to endure and compensate, not to flash warning lights on a dashboard.
That's a good point.
Prediabetes is asymptomatic by design. You don't feel nerve degradation or early-stage capillary stiffening on a random Tuesday afternoon.
Right.
The pancreas manages to keep the glucose just low enough to prevent acute diabetic ketoacidosis or, hyperglycemic coma. The system sacrifices long-term sustainability for immediate survival.
Wow.
This is exactly why proactive metabolic screening is just non-negotiable for healthy aging. Simple fasting blood glucose and HbA1c tests can instantly detect this silent phase. But, provided you actually get the blood work done.
Because if you miss that window of compensation, the system fundamentally breaks.
It does.
In 2019, 11.3% of the U.S. population had crossed the threshold into full clinical diabetes, with nearly a quarter of them completely undiagnosed.
That's a massive issue.
But, lumping all diabetes into one bucket kind of obscures the mechanical failures at play. So let's look at how the medical community categorizes this crisis, starting with type 1.
So type 1 diabetes is a complete manufacturing failure. It's an autoimmune condition where the body's immune system erroneously identifies the insulin-producing beta cells in the pancreas as foreign invaders and literally destroys them.
So the signal is just gone. There is no insulin to dock with the receptors.
Zero endogenous insulin. It accounts for about 5 to 10% of cases, often presenting in use, but certainly possible in adulthood.
Right.
Because the hardware that produces insulin is permanently destroyed, the patient faces an absolute insulin deficiency. There is currently no cure, and it demands lifelong, externally administered insulin just to keep that cellular transport system running.
Right, so that's type 1. Contrast that with type 2 diabetes, which accounts for the vast majority of cases. Type 2 is the culmination of that pre-diabetic state we just discussed.
Yes.
It's a communication failure. The beta cells in the pancreas finally buckle under the pressure of constantly overproducing insulin to overcome the body's resistance.
The technical term is a relative insulin deficiency.
Relative, okay.
The cells violently resist the signal, and the worn-out pancreas can no longer produce enough volume to force the issue. This is the variant heavily intertwined with metabolic syndrome, older age, and increasingly, unfortunately, poor childhood nutrition.
Yeah, that's a whole other issue. But the sources also highlight a third category that provides a fascinating window into how hormones manipulate our metabolism, right?
No.
gestational diabetes mellitus, or GDM.
Right.
This occurs in roughly 10% of pregnancies.
And the mechanics of gestational diabetes are an incredible evolutionary stress test.
How so?
During pregnancy, the placenta is an aggressive, greedy organ. It prioritizes the fetus's growth above almost anything else. To ensure the fetus gets enough energy, the placenta releases a cocktail of hormones, specifically human placental lactogen, alongside elevated cortisol, estrogen, and progesterone.
Which actively induce a state of insulin resistance in the mother.
Exactly. They intentionally block the mother's insulin signaling pathways. The placenta is chemically forcing the mother's blood sugar to remain elevated so that more glucose crosses over to the developing baby.
Wow, so it's a feature, not a bug.
Right. In a healthy metabolism, the mother's pancreas just scales up insulin production to balance it out. But if the mother's metabolic reserve is low, or she already has underlying resistance, she develops gestational diabetes.
Which usually resolves post-delivery once the placenta is gone, right?
Usually, yes.
But it serves as a massive, glaring warning sign. It exposes a fragility in the cellular signaling network, significantly raising the risk of developing type 2 diabetes later in life.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it brings us to the core philosophical shift in how we approach this condition today.
Right, because historically, a type 2 diabetes diagnosis was treated as a one-way street.
Totally.
The medical consensus was simply to manage the inevitable decline. But modern endocrinology, as highlighted in the My-Nutri-Diary course materials, has kind of shattered that paradigm.
It really have.
Type 2 diabetes can be put into remission.
Yes.
We actually have the power to repair the communication failure. But there is a massive caveat that we need to clarify here, and it's a huge focus of the article. Remission is heavily dependent on intervention during the early stages of the disease.
This is the most critical biological limitation to understand. Remission relies entirely on the viability of your beta cells.
The ones producing the insulin.
Right. When you have prediabetes or early stage type 2, your beta cells are exhausted and dysfunctional, but they're still alive.
Okay, so they can recover.
Exactly. But if you wait a decade, the chronic stress and toxicity of high blood sugar cause those beta cells to undergo apoptosis, which is programmed cell death.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Once the beta cells physically die off, your ability to naturally regulate insulin is gone permanently. The window for remission closes.
So the clock is really ticking the moment cellular resistance begins.
Absolutely.
But the tools to repair the signaling are surprisingly fundamental, you know? Targeted nutrition and physical exertion. And I want to dig into the physical aspect because the mechanics here are phenomenal.
Yeah.
We always hear exercise is good for you, but the article details why it works on a molecular level.
Yeah.
You do not need to be an elite athlete. A simple, brisk walk fundamentally alters your glucose transport system. I mean, here's where it gets really interesting. You don't necessarily have to become an Olympic powerlifter. Just brisk walking can start fixing those cellular communication breakdowns.
This is where human physiology feels almost like magic.
Yeah.
Remember how we said insulin is the primary signal that tells the GLUT4 proteins to rise to the cell surface?
Right, the protocol docking at the server farm.
Exactly. Well, muscle contraction offers a completely independent pathway. When you engage in a brisk walk, the physical contraction of your muscle fibers depletes your internal ATP energy stores.
Okay.
And this depletion activates an energy-sensing enzyme called AMPK.
And AMPK acts as an override switch.
It bypasses the broken insulin receptor entirely. AMPK directly commands the GLUT4 proteins to migrate to the cell membrane and open the gates.
Wait, really?
Yes. By simply moving your legs, you are manually forcing the cell to clear the glucose out of the bloodstream, completely independent of the pancreas.
That is a staggering takeaway for anyone listening. You are literally manually overriding a broken biological system.
You are.
And the sources point out that combining this cardiovascular movement with strength training provides a compound effect.
Oh, definitely.
Because while walking burns the circulating glucose, strength training actually builds new muscle tissue. You are physically constructing more metabolic storage space, creating a larger reservoir to safely sink that glucose into.
You're building metabolic hardware. But we also have to acknowledge the medical interventions available for severe cases.
Right, of course.
The landscape has shifted dramatically with bariatric surgery demonstrating high rates of early remission by physically altering the digestive tract and its hormonal signaling.
True.
Furthermore, we are seeing the rise of potent anti-diabetic medications like semaglutide, the GLP-1 receptor agonists.
Right. These medications are undeniably powerful tools, particularly for severe obesity. They slow gastric emptying and heavily stimulate insulin secretion.
They do.
But the My-Nutri-Diary materials urge a balanced perspective here. Outsourcing your metabolic regulation to pharmaceuticals comes with a heavy physical and financial toll.
Because they are profound chemical interventions. They artificially manipulate your appetite and digestion, often carrying severe gastrointestinal side effects.
Yeah, I've read about those.
And importantly, they do not necessarily repair the underlying mitochondrial dysfunction or build the muscle mass required for long-term resilience.
Which is what you need for healthy aging.
Exactly. Living with advanced diabetes, relying on a complex web of medications, constantly monitoring blood sugar, and managing the inevitable complications is a brutal burden.
Yeah.
Early behavioral intervention allows you to fix the root cause rather than perpetually medicating the symptoms.
We have mapped out a really complex biological landscape today.
We covered a lot.
We looked at how glucose requires the delicate choreography of insulin protocols and GLUT4 transport proteins to safely enter our cells.
Right.
We examined how chronic overexposure leads to a breakdown in that communication, forcing the pancreas into a desperate state of overproduction that quietly damages our vasculature.
And the nerves.
And the nerves, yeah. We differentiated the permanent hardware failure of type 1 from the signal degradation of type 2. And we arrived at the empowering reality that in its early stages, metabolic dysfunction is a reversible condition.
The human body is remarkably forgiving if you give it the right inputs before the structural damage becomes permanent.
That's a great way to put it.
The transition from insulin resistance to healthy aging is entirely a matter of cellular signaling, and, well, you control the inputs to that system.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to carry forward today. We talked about AMPK and muscle contractions, but think about it practically.
Yeah.
The next time you finish a meal and choose to take a brisk 15-minute walk, recognize what is actually happening beneath your skin. You aren't just engaging in generic wellness or burning a few trivial calories.
Not at all.
You are manually firing electrical signals through your muscle tissue. You are activating an ancient enzyme that commands thousands of microscopic transport proteins to rise to the surface of your cells, physically pulling corrosive sugar out of your blood.
It's incredible.
With every step, you are actively writing the code for your own healthy aging.